On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Big Ten, your daily podcast on the Big Ten Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
As we continue to nap in May, not full-blown sleep in May, but nap in May, and they take a very early look to the 2021-22 college basketball season, and specifically for the Big Ten Conference, in a year that I think will be very different for the Big Ten Conference, we continue to take a deeper dive into that transformation on today's episode. So hello, everybody, and welcome to the Locked On Big Ten Podcast, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Ben Stevens. It is Tuesday, May 18th. And part of that transformation that I think might move some teams from the top of the conference to the bottom and vice versa is Indiana basketball. So who else to go to but our Indiana everything expert, our guy back on the podcast for what feels like it's been way too long, but he's here once again, Jack Grossman, back here, the host of the Crimson Coverage podcast for ESPN Louisville, doing everything for ESPN Louisville. And Jack, we are pleased to have you back on the show once again.
Always appreciate coming on, Ben. I love the new video. I must say, though, that cannot be a coincidence that of all the great podcasts that the Locked On Network has, that they have the Locked On Big Ten right next to the Locked On SEC podcast in the intro graphic. I mean, that can't be a coincidence, right?
Jack, it's all part of the great congruency of the Locked On Podcast Network's college channel. You transitioned me very well into my reminder to everybody that not just Locked On Big Ten, but the other four Power 5 conferences are all covered. New Locked On ACC, new Locked On Pac-12, Locked On SEC, and Locked On Big 12, keeping you up to date with their respective leagues like we do here on Locked On Big Ten. And Jack, as we dive in to the Big Ten basketball schedule, taking a super early look, way too early, but what else are you going to do in the middle of May?
Too early.
I agree with your statement there, Jack. I completely agree, and that's what we're doing here. I think the pitch for this episode overall is the transformative nature of this upcoming year, 2021-22, in the Big Ten Conference. And I think Indiana plays a big part in that. Of course, firing Archie Miller this offseason, bringing in Mike Woodson, some tumultuous kind of turns there, but now seemingly set up for success with hitting the transfer portal hard, bringing back all of the guys that were in the transfer portal for the most part, back to Bloomington. I think Indiana will play a big factor in how the Big Ten Conference shapes out this upcoming basketball season.
Well, Indiana certainly hopes those for sure there, as it's been as we know, it's been a struggle for Indiana the past few years under Archie Miller, even the last year Tom Green as well. Just getting Trey Jackson, everything else is great. Great. There's still some questions which we can get into later, but at the end of the day, getting Trace Jackson Davis, who I would argue is one of the 15 best players in the sport and maybe should be the preseason player of the year in the Big Ten, getting him back is monumental. It's huge, and it is the biggest and best thing Mike Woodson could have done that no one, including myself, gave him any shot of actually doing. That's nothing against Mike Woodson, just the full expectation was, okay, Trace Jackson Davis, he balls out year 2, averages almost 20 points a game, still can't shoot. You can develop that in the pros. You might as well just go while you're still young and start your pro career. But Woodson was able to sit Trace Jackson Davis down and talk him into actually coming back, which was something that absolutely no one expected. And that takes the Indiana roster and combined to bring back most of the other guys in the portal as well. And he goes from a place, like I'll compare it to this. When Indiana hired Archie Miller, and I don't want this to be a negative comparison, but when Indiana hired Archie Miller, IU fans are going to be really patient with him. But when he signed Romeo Langford and he brought back Juwan Morgan going into year 2, that's where expectations jumped. It said, okay, you got a top 5 recruit in Romeo, a 5-star. You got a top 10 recruiting class. You got an all Big Ten forward in Juwan Morgan. Let's go. It's time to start winning. Obviously, he didn't win. But you're seeing a similar thing, not to the same extent because it's still only going to be year 1, happening to where it was just going to be a year where, okay, Mike Woodson get his feet wet. It didn't really matter if you make the tournament or not. Now we're just trying to set things up for the long term too. No, you have Trace Jackson Davis. You have to find a way to make the tournament with Trace Jackson Davis on the roster. That's basically what the last guy got fired, so he couldn't make the tournament with Trace Jackson Davis on the roster. So there's no excuses now with that guy in the fold and being on the team and being such a critical part of that team. There's still a lot of questions with the roster. I think it's a very interestingly constructed roster, but getting Trace Jackson Davis back, it has put an expectation of at least you got to make the bleeping tournament, man. It's been since 2016 since IU's been in the tournament. You got a top 15 player in the sport. You have to find a way to be one of the 68 best teams in the country.
I completely agree with you. I think that was the biggest knock against Archie Miller. I have said for a lot of time here about Indiana basketball, having Trace Jackson Davis, surround him with even decent shooting, that's a tournament team. He himself is talented enough to take a roster into the NCAA tournament. I think Indiana is set up to do that this year. But Jack, I think you bring up a good point about expectations, because when Mike Woodson was hired, myself included, some people were skeptical. Was this the right move? What exactly would this mean for the future direction? Right. And we had that conversation, and I think it was founded. But I also think we can sit here right now and say, based on the moves that Indiana basketball and Mike Woodson specifically has made this offseason, he's not made us eat our words so much, but be like, okay, maybe this guy is moving Indiana basketball forward in a positive direction. At least that's how I feel right now. But I think that also is coupled with expectation. And as we started to dive into this Big Ten basketball schedule for this upcoming year, we started by power ranking, in a way, the top of the Big Ten Conference, who we expect to be competitive for those double buys in the Big Ten tournament, the top 5 teams, if you will, to the top half of the Big Ten Conference. I slated IU at 5th out of the 14 teams. Where do you think IU will find itself as we get to this upcoming Big Ten basketball year?
I think 5th might be a little bit higher than what I have them at. I mean, I think the Big Ten probably isn't going to be as good as it was last year, and that's not a knock on 10. I mean, the Big Ten's coming off maybe the best 2 years the conference has ever had in a lot of ways. Even with the disappointing NCAA tournament, you can't say the league wasn't any good. That just wouldn't be, watching what happened all season long in the Big Ten. But I still think it'll be a really good league, but I don't think it'll be as elite as it had been the past couple of years. And then you have teams like Illinois losing Io and Kofi Coburn, so they won't be the factor that they were. You have Wisconsin, even though they bring back Brad Davidson for an 87th year, they lose a bunch of guys. So you have 2 teams that are kind of going to fall back. You figure Maryland will be back up to where they were a couple years ago under Mark Turgeon. I think Purdue and Ohio State are the 2 big Final Four and national title contenders of the league, to where I think those 3 plus Michigan State, I would say I think those are 5 teams to name, but I think those 5 I think are kind of tier 1A/tier 1, to where I think those 5 will be the teams that everyone's going to be chasing out of that. Then I throw Indiana in that second group of kind of like maybe 5th, 6th, 7th or 8th range, kind of. I would say probably 6th or 7th-ish range to where I think there's just a lot of unknowns. There's still questions about the shooting. There's questions about what type of style Mike Woodson's actually going to play, which I think with the latest roster moves of Jerome Hunter leaving and Michael Dirk coming in, I think that makes it a lot more difficult to play how Mike Woodson said he was going to play in his introductory press conference. But I don't think Indiana's quite ready to be up in the upper echelon yet. But if they're just in the middle pack, be 6th or 7th, make the big dance, I think that would be a pretty good year for them. Which the schedule opens up for that. I mean, they only get Michigan State once, and they only get Michigan once, which is very helpful. They get Minnesota twice, who is going to be in a full rebuild mode. But it doesn't help that they get Purdue and Ohio State and Maryland twice. But I mean, you do catch a break, only getting each of the Michigan schools once, and Iowa, who will probably fall back a bit as well once as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think Indiana's schedule is right there in the middle of the pack in terms of how we ranked easiest versus hardest. It's not one that stands out that you're like, oh, God, that's going to be a gauntlet. It's also not one that's going to be a breeze as well. Having 3 of those top 4 teams in my Big Ten power rankings in Maryland, Ohio State, and Purdue twice is difficult, but to only have Michigan and Michigan State once in that game against the Wolverines inside Assembly Hall, I think does set up for a little bit of a just lukewarm schedule, if you will. Nothing that's going to be like, wow, this stands out as this is going to be a murderer's row, but nothing that's also the easiest breeze through the Big Ten Conference. And
it's a very fair schedule.
Right. It's fair. Yeah. Exactly. I put it the same way. Those teams that you mentioned towards the top is how I feel the same exact way. I have Indiana, Michigan State kind of on that second peg behind the top 4 that I think are pretty solidified at the moment, with Purdue, Michigan, Maryland, and Ohio State in there. I think the bottom 4, at least as it stands right now on paper in the Big Ten Conference, also a little bit easier to decipher through, with Minnesota having all of the roster turnover and a new head coach. Penn State, very similar place. I think you could throw Northwestern and Nebraska kind of in that mold as well. Although I think Nebraska has a lot of talent that having Bryce McGowan's and Trey McGowan's there, maybe a little bit better, but probably still to the bottom half of the conference. And then you have some of those traditional powers, at least that we've seen in the past 3 or 5 years, like Iowa and Wisconsin. They might take a slide back because of the loss of production they suffered as well. So I think that's kind of how the conference shakes out. But you were talking about the roster construction that Mike Woodson has put together entering his first year in Bloomington, Indiana. What have you made of all the transfer portal moves, all the roster moves that Mike Woodson has made this offseason?
I mean, he did a great job of getting, 4 of the 5 guys that were in the portal back, losing Armand Franklin, who was the most important piece of anyone he could have brought back that was in the portal. But, he's going to get a Virginia player, Tony Bennett. That's kind of a perfect fit for him. So you can't really get too mad about that. But what I'm wondering and what kind of questions me is, where's the shooting going to come from and who's going to play on the wing for this team? Because, I mean, Mike Woodson talked about how he wanted to play 4 out, 1 in. He wanted to modernize the offense, which is all great things and all things that I want to hear as someone, watching Archie Miller for the last 4 years. That's what you want to see. You want to see more tempo. You want to see more shooting, and you want to see an actual space floor. Look at Indiana's roster right now, and I was just kind of diagramming it earlier. I mean, you have 3 point guards in Xavier Johnson, Rob Finney, and Christian Lander. You have basically 4 shooting guards in Parker Stewart, Tamar Bates, the 5-star recruit, which was a huge, huge steal for Woodson and his staff. Mm-hmm. Then you have Leal and Galloway. Galloway, who is only 6'4". I thought he was taller than that, but IU has him listed as a guard. He's only 6'4", so we're going to go with that. Then power forwards, I guess you're going to have to play Race Thompson at the power forward. I was really, hoping that they would play Trace and Race together less often, just because I get it. You're going to have a full offseason where you're going to want to try to develop their shots and to where Trace will maybe actually attempt a 3 next year, which he hasn't done yet in his Indiana career. But it's a different voice selling it, but we've been sold about how Trace and Race are going to shoot 3s for 3 years now. And it hasn't happened. So, I mean, I get it. It's a new coaching staff, new guys working with them. But when Archie Miller sold that year after year after year for so long and it never happened, you get where there's some caution there, correct?
Yeah.
Right, where you would say you're doing something drastically different, even though you're selling the same thing that the previous regime was selling, and it never happened. So, to me, you have to get one of those 2 guys to be able to shoot the ball from the outside, which is a big question mark. You have to get Jordan Geronimo to be able to shoot from the outside some, which he didn't really show much of. And you throw in Michael Durr and Logan Duncan, who are both true 5s, and you're like, okay, you have 4 or 5 guys that ideally, if you had enough wings, if you wanted to play 4 out, 1 in, that you would be playing all those guys at the 5. And 4, you have Miller Kopp, who's a 33% 3-point shooter, kind of a stretch forward. So not good, but a workable shooter, undersized with either Galloway or Leal at the 3. That Jerome Hunter really hurts because he was, other than Franklin, probably the best shooter on the team last year. He was a guy that was going to mesh in really well with Mike Woodson was going to. He could have played the 3 or the 4 interchangeable either way. Stretch the floor, shoot the ball. He made great strides and they probably could have played him 25, 30 minutes a game next year. And he decides to leave. Apparently he just didn't mesh that well with the staff, which is, that sucks, but that's whatever. You can understand the kid for leaving. But to replace him with Michael Durr, and I don't want to knock the kid, but I feel like you're just not really filling a need that you had on the roster to where you need more guys that can play the wing. I mean, we don't need to, mark it out as, small forward only, power forward only, shooting guard only, because it's 2021. It's positionless basketball. But you do need guards, wings, and bigs. And I feel like Indiana really only has about 1.5, 2 wings on the roster. And I'm like, okay, where are those 80 minutes going to come from for those 2 spots? Are you going to be playing 2 big men, or are you going to be playing a bunch of guards? And either way, there are massive issues with doing either thing.
I agree with you, and I think that's a great point. I think that was the biggest knock against Indiana this past year is they didn't have the consistent shooting around TJD to really be a viable threat in the Big Ten Conference, where if you had the ability to crash Trace Jackson Davis inside in the paint, you were going to do that, and Indiana did not shoot the ball well enough to be the successful team that obviously Hoosier fans want them to be from that deep portion. I think getting Miller Kopp, the transfer for Northwestern, might present a little ability to stretch the floor. We know Christian Lander can shoot. It's about building that confidence again.
Either makes it or it's an air ball. There's no in between.
Exactly. And I think a lot of that is confidence. And I think he was put into a tough spot last year in his true freshman year under Archie Miller, but that's a different conversation for a different day. Rob Finney, you have your hesitation. He's been there long enough where I think you know his game as well. Xavier Johnson it is, right? Am I mistaken his last name?
Yeah, no, you're right.
I don't know exactly his game, but he's more of a guard facilitator type, if I'm not mistaken. But a big transfer.
Well, he brings something. He brings something that Indiana really needs, and that's the ability to attack off the dribble, break down a defense from the perimeter, get to the lane, and score and find other guys. Like that's something that Indiana hasn't had a guy other than Romeo Langford in the last 4 or 5 years could initiate offense and create his own shot, other than throwing it to either Juwan Morgan or Trace Jackson Davis in the post. And Xavier Johnson is very much a guy that can do it. He's not a great shooter, but he's very much a guy that can straight line drive, dribble drive, whatever phrase you want to coin or use to the basket. He can break down a defense and create shots for himself and others. And that's a skill that Indiana desperately needs. And that is something that's going to be extremely helpful, just so there are guys around him that can knock down shots and help with that. You can run pick and rolls with Xavier Johnson and TJD, and if you're playing a 2-on-2 game, you might never get a stop. But the problem is basketball at the college level, the last time I checked, was 5-on-5. So you need Rob Finney to hit threes. You need Lander to hit some threes. You need Galloway to be better than 18% from behind the arc. You need Miller Kopp to be the guy he was 2 years ago when he shot almost 40% instead of the guy that only hit a third of his threes last season. You absolutely need Race Thompson and Jordan Geronimo to figure out how to shoot from the perimeter. Because if not, then it's going to be a similar issue that what we've had the last few years of there's just not enough shooting to go around, that clogs the lane, and we all know how that goes. But this time on the other end, they may not be set up as well defensively either, because you're either going to be playing big guys at the 4, small guys at the 3, to where there could potentially be some matchup issues there. Just on the topic of, I'm sorry if I'm rambling, but on playing the two bigs together, because I keep comparing it to kind of like what Wisconsin's had the last few years of Ethan Happ and Micah Potter, to where Greg Gard this past year almost never played them together, which I did not understand, which is kind of the opposite.
You mean Nate Reavers? Nate Reavers and Micah Potter. Yeah.
Yes,
Ethan Happ a couple years ago.
Yes, Nate Reavers. There we go. Too many tall white Wisconsin big men. But Nate Reavers and Micah Potter the last couple years, thank you for correcting me. But
no worries.
For them, I always wanted them to play together because they could both shoot the ball. They could both stretch the floor, to where that presented so many matchup issues for other teams playing two bigs together that could shoot the ball, to where you gained so much of that. And Indiana tries to do the same thing with Race and Trace, but because neither one's a threat from the outside, you end up just clogging the lane together, to where I wanted Wisconsin last year, which they finally did for some reason in only the North Carolina game in the first round of the NCAA tournament, played them both together, and they beat the Tar Heels by about 25. Mm-hmm. But Indiana sticking to that with Trace and Race really, really hurt them offensively, to where it just limited so much of what they were trying to do. And I think they could be stuck with that again with the roster they have coming back.
And that was an issue Illinois faced for a couple of years as well, with Kofi Coburn and Georgi Bezhanishvili off the bench as well, because both of them, very similar styles of play, where Georgi might take a three once a game, once every couple of games, but
I think he hit 3 of his 4 threes on the season against Indiana last year.
Yeah, maybe so. But
I mean, Brad Underwood would stagger them, though, and I thought he did a really, really great job of staggering them.
And that might be a way for Mike Woodson to utilize Race Thompson and Trace Jackson Davis as well. So I agree with your point about roster construction. Still questions to be had. I just think with all the moves that were made this year for Indiana, and I think you agree with this sentiment, they are set up for success, I think, at a higher level than people expected maybe 2 or 3 months ago after the Archie Miller firing. So I think, Jack, as we end out this episode, kind of looking at the Big Ten in a bigger picture way, what are some of your biggest sentiments about the Big Ten basketball conference coming up for 2021 and 22?
Are they ever going to win a national title? I mean, it's been since 2000, man. I mean, the league was as good as it's ever been this past year, and you still can't get one. I mean, I get it. Baylor was absolutely incredible. Gonzaga was undefeated. But the league hasn't been as good as it was last year very often, to where you have to figure out a way to win a national title. And I think this is where Indiana kind of plays into it, because I get it. IU's not a blue blood anymore. They aren't on the same level as Kentucky, Kansas, and Duke, and as they used to be, and North Carolina obviously as well. But when you look at the Big Ten normally, the last 2 years being a huge exception, when the Big Ten is good, Indiana is normally good. Good to where IU has 5 national titles. I think Michigan State has 2. Does anyone else have multiple titles? I think Ohio State may have 2. Indiana, Indiana wins a lot of the Big Ten's national championships. I'm not saying they're the only school that can do it, but it's not a coincidence that Indiana's had the 2 worst basketball decades of their history since 2000, and the Big Ten hasn't won a title since 2000. To where for the Big Ten, I think to get back to that level of winning a national championship, which they've had plenty of teams that have been good enough to do it, they just haven't done it for one reason or another. You got to get Indiana back in the fold. I mean, Indiana being good at basketball is good for the Big Ten, and I can say that as someone who went to IU. Purdue fans hate IU, but they would say, "Look, the Big Ten's better when IU is good." I mean, that's just something you can't ignore. Nor to where there's a lot of great programs in the league, but you need to figure out a way to get Indiana right. And when I say you, I mean Indiana needs to figure out a way to get Indiana right. And Mike Woodson's the answer, then that's only good for the conference. Because when you look at when the Big Ten's been successful, when they've had teams win the national championship, Indiana is either the team winning the national championship or they were a really real factor in the race during it, to where Indiana has to figure out a way to get right, and that'll only help the Big Ten's cause to where you got to win a national championship. That's just where you're at right now. It's been 2 decades. Yeah. You got to find a way to do it, whether it's
Jack,
IU or anyone else.
Yeah. I think that's a perfectly articulated point. I think it's a great point. And that's why I think this episode talking about the transformative nature of the Big Ten Conference's upcoming basketball season, IU is going to play a huge factor in that. Yes, it's just year 1 of a new regime under Mike Woodson and Thad Matta as the associate AD and all that good stuff. But it does lay the groundwork for what I think is a transitional year in all of college basketball. And I think Indiana does play a huge role in how that looks specifically in the Big Ten Conference right now. And you bring up another great point. It is not just coincidence at this point. The Big Ten has not won a national title in men's basketball in 21 seasons. You can't just say, oh, shucks, we got there and almost got it. No, there's a reason for this right now. And that's what I think the Big Ten Conference is working towards. It's going to be a fascinating year, this upcoming college basketball season, which starts in like 6 months, 8 months, something like that, whatever, November. So a lot of time left to figure it out. But Jack Grossman giving you a beautiful early look, not just at Indiana and where they sit, but how that all plays into the Big Ten Conference for 2021-22. Jack, you are Indiana everything expert for a reason. One of the best Big Ten minds I know. An incredible job once again today, my friend.
Thanks, Ben. Always enjoy it.